Hello and welcome to our next Q&A session here with Principal Chairs. We've got Aldo Baerten with us here today. Aldo is Principal Flute of the Antwerp Symphony Orchestra, Professor of Flute at the Royal Conservatoire of Antwerp, Utrecht Conservatoire, Cologne Conservatoire, and he is also a regular jury member for many international flute competitions. Welcome, Aldo.
Hello, everybody. Good evening.
Thank you very much for being with us here today. I hope you're all well in your country with that your orchestra is surviving in these difficult times. We've got
We're sort of surviving, yes.
yeah. We've got lots of questions for Aldo here today. To anybody who's watching, please do comments below the video on Facebook, and you can have we'll be able to see those questions, and then Aldo can answer them live for you. So please comment below. But for now, we'll start with this question that we've had sent in advance from Ron. And that first question for today for you, Aldo, is how do you navigate the always demanding birds passage from Saint-Saëns' Carnival of the Animals and the awkward straits in Prokofiev's Classical Symphony?
Okay, yes, those are really two of the most tricky solos we have on the flute. And they are both very virtuoso and very, very demanding. So I try to practice them very regularly, because when it comes up to when you have to play Carnival of the Animals, Saint-Saëns, and you have only a week to practice it, it's never enough. So I tend to practice it all the time a little bit. Now and then, when I'm in a practice session, I just work a little on it, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, just to keep it going. You know, there's a very funny story of Julius Baker, a very famous American flutist who was principal at New York Phil. He had his flute next to his bed, and in the morning he would always play the birds from Saint-Saëns and the Mendelssohn. And when that worked, he would get out of bed. I don't know if the story is but I don't practice it in bed, but I practice it every day and a little bit. You know, we often do articulation exercises, but you can as well do it on this little passage, because it's something you always need for auditions. And actually, it comes up quite a lot in concerts also. It's a lovely piece, and it's a fantastic piece. And then when we have to play our little line, it's quite tricky. Yeah. So what I always do is, we are so focused on articulation when we play this. We think the tongue can do everything, but it's actually not true. The tongue can do very little. It makes a little clarity, and that's all. And the rest is airstream and help of the abdominal muscles. So I would first always practice it legato. And then, for example, go on to just using abdominal little pulse. So you just work on your diaphragm region, the clarity of speaking without the tongue, which is much more difficult, because once you use the tonguing, it's actually very, very easy to make clarity in your flute playing. When you do it without it, it's pretty difficult. Then I will go on playing it just on two. So very, very single tonguing, very slow. And then the little brother of the double articulation, the double staccato, which we actually never practice enough. It always comes as the little brother after the two. Yeah, we can practice the gu 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 gu, like we say, good guy. And then you go into gu du gu du gu du gu du gu du. So you do the double staccato, but turned around. And then you go to the real one. Now, until now, I've only used slow fingers, digga, 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 da, but fast articulation. Now you can go into fast articulation with fast fingers, which means, yeah. And what is very important is we think about the musical line, we think about airstream, and not too much about the tongue, because that actually holds us back. You can also practice with different rhythms to get the fingers really nicely in line with the articulation, like or the opposite. would say practice it a lot, very slowly, and very, very little by little increase the tempo. So if you go from about 60 and you go to your fastest tempo, which you need to play this, which is about 144 or 160 on the metronome, you can push your tempo every day a little bit. And then you're quite comfortable in the concert because you know you can actually play it quite faster than what might happen with the strings. So this is a good way to practice it. That's about the birds. Now the classical symphony is a little different because it has absolutely no freedom. You have to play so fast and so exact, and this ping pong game between the first and the second flute, where you go yeah. So you also need to practice it together with your second flute player, like a team which teams up to play it together. Yeah. Again, when you have very difficult things, practice a lot slowly. When it's slow, you can listen. When it's slow, you can correct things in your fingers, in your articulation. So again, when we do articulation, think about airstream. Otherwise, the articulation becomes very dry. If you play, then there's less airstream but more tongue, but it speaks less. If you do a little bit more airstream and less tongue, it becomes like this. And then you can speed up. Yeah. So this is a good way to practice. And again, with different rhythms. So the fingers become very, very, very clear together with the tongue. I think in this piece, there's also this little issue of the D major scale going up very, 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 very fast to the highest D we have. Now, when I was a student, I didn't like practicing scales up to D4 because I thought D4 was not a very beautiful note. But then, of course, when you start in the orchestra and you start doing all these books with excerpts, you see that there's quite a lot, quite high up in the flute. Yeah, and one of these is this piece, this Prokofiev Classical Symphony, where a lot of scales go until D4. So never forget that when you're a student, you practice also your scales up to D4 all the time and in many different tempos. Start very slowly because it's fingerings we learn later in life than the regular second and third octave fingerings. And because we rarely use them, they're not in our brain, they're not in our memory like the other fingerings. So when you do scales, do play scales from the lowest B, if you have a B foot, up to the D4 all the time, so that it becomes actually like a normal note, a normal range also until D4. It's not something special which you use once in a while. So I would say if you do all of that, you'll be pretty prepared for these difficult little solos.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Our next question here is from Millie, and she asks, what is it like being a jury member of an international competition, and what do you look for in the contestants?
Well, of course, you always look for music. So you like to hear a musical personality. Now, of course, if that musical personality plays out of tune, that's a pity. Or if the technique doesn't follow the music, that's a pity. So you try to find the most complete person who is a fine flute player. That doesn't mean you can never make a mistake, but somebody where most of the technical stuff is okay, is working. Is the intonation good? Is it a good sound? Do the fingers move? And then, of course, comes the whole musical perspective. Do you play with stylistic differences? If you play a Bach sonata and then you play Prokofiev, can you make two different worlds out of that? Are you also a person who is easy on stage or not? Because of course you can be a very good flute player, but if you stand there and you're deadly frightened to play, then it's also not exactly what we need. So I think it's a very complete person with a solid base, an interesting personality, somebody who tells you a musical story, because very often now we're about perfection and not making mistakes. But of course, we also need somebody who brings us to a different a different level of listening. And that different level of listening is when you forget about the technique and you forget where you are and you forget in which hall you sit, but you are just listening to beautiful music. And I think if you achieve that, then you've probably heard somebody who stands a fair chance in a competition as a player.
Yeah. Can I ask, do you enjoy being a jury member for the competitions?
Yes and no, because I'm always very frightened for them. Oh dear, these poor people who have to go through this. Now, of course, when we go to a competition as a student, we always, in our brain, make it worse than what it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
We're very, very stressed about it, and we're very young, and we have probably very little experience with doing these things. When you sit behind a table and you listen, it's a little different. You see it with a different perspective. You're not annoyed by a wrong note or a note out of tune. You listen very carefully if the flute playing is in balance, but you also are charmed or attracted by a story and colors, and also how people play together with their pianist, for example, than just being focused on a few wrong notes. It can happen to anybody,
Mm-hmm.
to make a wrong note or to miss a little run. But if you play a whole competition program without the feeling that you're actually on stage to make music, to tell your audience something, I find that's a little bit of a pity.
Mm. Yeah. Now another question from Ron, sorry. Do you play or follow jazz flute?
Well, I love listening to jazz flute because I think it's one of the instruments which is so flexible in the sound that actually when you play jazz you can find completely different colors than when you play your Schubert variations or your Prokofiev sonata. So it's actually very, very, very lovely to listen to it. For a while I have played with a jazz pianist just because I wanted to know how this actually worked. So you get this scheme of chords.
Yeah.
And of course, we as playing melodies and know harmonies all the time. We are so used to we are so used not to be busy with harmony, and then you have to be busy with harmony because you get a schedule G7, G minor going into D, and then please go ahead and play. Now, of course, in the beginning, I was completely lost because I had never learned this, but by doing it, you actually become much better, and you actually start to understand how it works. And if you pick it up, also, it becomes like a second little voice in your head, and you start to know where to go. Now, of course, what I did was almost close to zero because I just did it for fun. But I thought it was interesting to do because it's a completely different world than what we, as classical flute players in an orchestra doing chamber music, what we do. We have our parts printed out, and we play music which is written out. And it's a completely different angle. I thought, especially for this reason, I found it very, very interesting to do.
Yeah.
And although in the beginning it was very, very difficult, I think it's a completely different atmosphere. Also, you have many more possibilities. I mean, based on the harmonies, you can go anywhere you want. You can actually do whatever you want. You can make it lyrical. You can make it virtuoso. And I'm very much always when I listen to these people, I'm very much in admiration because what they do is fantastic, and it's based on just a scheme of chords, and all the rest is somewhere in here.
Yeah.
But I don't do it anymore because I would have to go a little deeper into it to make it better, and it's a different world, and I don't always have time to spend time on this.
Yeah. And now a question from Paul. What would you be if you weren't a flute player?
Yeah. Well, before I became a flute player, I hesitated a lot because I was in a school called the European School in Brussels, and we had a very international surrounding. So I thought I was going to do something in that area. I loved languages, I loved reading, so I thought I would study something with literature or maybe political science, travel, and do this kind of thing. But I love this little metal tube so much. And I gave myself a year after graduating from school to see if I would study music, if I would like it, and if I would be good enough at it. Because I thought, maybe I'm the worst in the class, and then I should do something else. And then after a year, there was no hesitation anymore. I knew that this was my path, and that I still find it up today a very interesting, a very inspiring life, a very exciting life, a never boring life. So I'm very happy I chose it. So I've never regretted to have become a flute player. But I think there are so many possibilities when you're 17 or 18 that different doors are open, and you really, really have to find your path. And I often say to my students, if you come to a musical education, it's also a tryout of a year. Do you love spending your whole day with an instrument? Do you love being on stage? Do you love just spending time on this? Or are you easily bored with it? Then you do something else. But if it's your path, then I don't think you can do anything else than this. So although I looked at different paths, after a while it was very, very clear that this was my path.
Yeah. Brilliant. To anybody watching, just a reminder that if you have any questions for Aldo, please comment below the video and we'll be able to see those, and then Aldo can answer your questions for you. Now we have another question from Paul. Do you see online education as a step forward? Would you recommend your pupils and other flute players use online resources for their studies?
Well, I don't think it's a step forward to do online work. I think we are very, very dependent on sound, and the sound through a computer, even if it's a very good machine with a very good connection, is never the same as in a real hall. So what you do is very different than when you listen live. There's also, of course, I think an issue with how to tell your story. How can you tell a musical story to a computer, even if there is a face in that computer? Now, of course, in the last few months, we were obliged to teach online because we could see our students live. Of course, those were students I already knew. So by the fact that I knew them, I could also work with them online because I already knew them. I think if you have new students and you see them online for the first time, it must be very difficult to actually listen to them in a complete way, so that you can actually grab what you have to work on and what they are good at and what they need help with. So yes, it was a step forward for us, because otherwise we would not have seen our students for so many weeks, and that was impossible. And I think it's been very helpful to be able to do this. But I remember now in about the month of May that I was allowed to go into school for one of my students who was doing his final exam. And although he was in a sort of cage with 2.5 meter high plastic, and I had my mouth mask and all of these things, after 2 minutes I stopped him and I said to him, do you know how beautiful it is to listen to flute live? Yeah, I was almost completely under the emotion of listening to this sound again after 3 or 3.5 months. So it is very different. I think it's a good help, but it can never become the main thing. And I see also schools now for September, October have told me already that instrument lessons get priority in live lessons in the schools. And I'm very happy about that, because I think it's very, very difficult to judge sound, to judge musicality, to really be in contact with your student and really get the best out of them through a computer.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I was very happy it existed, because I also teach children in a music school, and I was very happy to see them every week online, and I think they needed it also because they needed this contact and they needed to prepare something and play it for their teacher.
Yeah.
Even more in urgent matter than uh, uh, students who are 25.
Hmm.
Yeah? So in that case, it was a real help. But I'm very happy when it disappears again.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, of course, online there is a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, students can find so much information online, recordings, but also, I mean, if you want to know something about a piece, it's just 2 clicks away.
Mm.
If you want to know something about a composer, it's 2 clicks away, which wasn't the case when I was a student. You had to go to the library and really look it up, which took a little more effort and discipline.
Mm.
But this is an incredible treasure we have now, as well as recordings, as books and text you can find. If you want to know something about a piece, or if there's a poem with the piece, or you want to know something about. The other day I was practicing Monsieur de la Péjodie from Roussel, from the Four Little Pieces from Roussel, and I found a whole article of 10 pages online on this person, this Monsieur de la Péjodie.
Mm.
So that of course is incredible that with 2 or 3 clicks you can find so much information. So I'm very happy with the internet as long as I don't have to teach on it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know where we'd be without it right now.
Exactly. Yeah. So we must be grateful that it exists, but it's to be used wisely.
Yes. We actually have a live question now, which I'll just put on the screen, from Sherry, and she asks, "What are your favourite exercises, things or exercises when you practice apart from playing chansons?"
Yeah, good question. Now, I think when we practice, we should always practice a little bit of everything every day. Um, Maybe one of my very favorite ones is harmonics. I love the sound of harmonics. They're very nicely in tune most of the time, sometimes even better in tune than the real notes. But they also have this lovely round velvety color. If you do you can really improve the color and the intonation of your sound. Yeah. If you use it as a flexibility exercise, you can also do something like this. Very good exercise. I use it, for example, also when I practice the very famous solo L'Après-midi d'un faune from Debussy in the orchestra, where you start with this very strange note, the empty tube, C sharp. Now, and that's really one of my favorite exercises, if you practice this note with a harmonic, and then go to the real note, it improves so much in color, in intonation, but also this empty note which has no resistance, by the fact that you practice it with a C sharp with resistance, makes all the difference because your body picks it up and actually understands how to blow in a better way to get this note resonating and also get much more color. So I think this is one of my very favorite I do every morning. Now in general, when you practice, try to do a little bit of everything. Yeah, you should do a little bit of warm up, a little bit of tone exercises, maybe a little work on vibrato, work a little with a tuner. Very, very important every day is that you check your tuning, and then work on articulation, work on your fingers. I think a very good practice routine is not one which takes hours and hours, but one which takes a little bit of everything, so that your whole basics, everything which we can do on a flute, like articulation, intonation, vibrato, different colors, different dynamics, you can practice everything every day, but not too much. It shouldn't take so much time before we go to etudes or pieces.
Yeah.
So it's a good thing to do a little bit of everything, and then you're ready for your day, and you have practiced actually everything You've covered everything you can. So I
Yeah.
think that's very important in practicing, is that it's balanced, you do everything, and it doesn't take up all of your time. You can also practice other things.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Sherry, for your question. Now, our next question is from Ellie, and she asks, how do you cope with nerves in auditions? Do you have any specific ways of working around these in your preparation?
I think nerves is something we never talk about, and that's one of the main issues. Now, I remember a conversation with a colleague, one of the one I esteemed one of the highest in my orchestra, really very musical, technically always great, the kind of player you listen to with pleasure when she or he has a solo. And I thought, oh, she must never be nervous. Until one day, we were just talking before a concert, and she said to me, I don't think I can play tonight. I am so terribly nervous. I said, what? You? But you're always so perfect, and always everything works. And she says, if you only knew how much I have to prepare for that. So the first thing is we don't ever talk about it. And I think almost everybody is nervous when they play. Nobody talks about it because it's like a zone we don't go into. Let's not talk about this. It's private. And I'm the only one suffering from it. Now, I think almost everybody suffers from it. I remember a concert where we had Martha Argerich, the very famous pianist, as a soloist. And right before she played the first chords of her concerto, I saw her hand go to the piano and it was a little shaking. So I thought, wow, this lady is one of the most fabulous players in the world. Is also probably a little nervous. So we first of all have to accept that everybody gets nervous and that everybody struggles with this. Now, as soon as you do that, it becomes more easy because you know you're not alone with it. Mostly we think we're alone with this little problem, but we're actually not. Everybody suffers from it. And if you start talking to people about it, then they sort of come to you and say, oh, you too? You're also nervous? But I thought you weren't.
Yeah.
So everybody thinks they're the only one, and actually we all suffer from it. Now, the best you can do is to prepare well. If you prepare well, you feel as safe as it's possible. If you practice well, if you master your basics, if you've practiced a piece, really slowly and in different tempos, with a strategy to get to the point where you want to get when you have to play it, then already you feel much more safe, you feel much more at ease to play it. I always say to my students, before you ever go to an audition, a competition, or any kind of exam, try to play the program a few times. The first time is always the most difficult one. And record yourself, because usually the result of what you do is much better than you think. So if you record yourself and then listen to yourself afterwards, you think, hey, that was actually better than I thought. It was actually pretty good. A number of things which I wanted to do are in there. That gives you, again, hope and faith that you can actually do it, because that's what happens. We lose the faith in what we can do.
Yeah.
So if you listen to yourself and you're actually quite happy with what you hear, that gives you strength to go on. Of course, we also always have to look at what can I do better, but that's the next step. Don't immediately say this and this and this was bad. First of all, it's never bad. It's only there to be improved. And the second thing is accept that you will probably never play a complete, perfect concert like you have it in your head. Because we usually have a version of what we play in our head. And then if it's not 100% like that, we think it's bad. Maybe it's just different. Or maybe that day you chose to go a little faster or a little slower. That doesn't mean it's bad. You just have to relativate a little more about that. What helps me also a lot is to be fit. I think if you're fit, the stress of the playing, which we all have, by the way, the stress is easily absorbed by your body. If you do a little bit of a workout, if you run, I run, I swim, I try to go into nature a lot.
Mm.
That helps also. So if you're very fit, for example, your heart rate and your blood pressure is lower than when you're not very fit, which means that if you go to a higher level because of your stress, you're still within a normal range of what your body can have. And the more fit you are, the more you can cope with these nerves and these little peaks of anxiety when you have to perform. I also think it's important not to make it too important. I mean, if you make a mistake in a concert, nobody will ever attack you for that. So we have to accept that live performances are live performances. They're not a CD recording, which took 3 days or 45 minutes. And we have to accept that a live performance is something which might not be perfect, but maybe has something more than a CD recording. Feelings, stories, something special in the atmosphere, which a recording sometimes doesn't have because it is so perfect. Now we're very used to listening to all kinds of perfect things now. Yeah, most of the recordings are spick and span, nothing you can say against it, and it's not reality. And then some of my students say, yes, but on the recording it was perfect. Yes, of course, but a recording is not a concert, except that it is something different than what you usually hear in a CD recording. Yeah? And don't make it too important. That means you're not gonna die if you make a mistake. And the next morning you get up and you start again, and it's fine. Yeah? We are only humans. I think what is important also is to stay fresh in your mind. Stay fresh. Don't overdo the work. Don't over practice. Stay fresh in your mind and be open. If you play, for example, chamber music, and somebody does something else than usual, go along with it. Be open, listen, be aware of what happens around you, and make music together, even if it's different than what you did in your practice time. There's also, in the last few years, a lot of attention in schools to mental preparation. And we can read some very good books, some very good articles, which tell us actually what happens to you when you get nervous. Yeah. There are very, very good books, and get them, read them, search for articles online, and work on this issue of preparing also. When you see tennis players or football players and you see their interviews after the match, they're always like full of energy and saying, yes, and this we did really well, and there we really countered it and we won. And they are proud, they are full of energy because they won. If we could use a little bit of that energy of sports people and make ourselves very positive before the concert, and wish each other luck just before, and make a great atmosphere, I am sure we would be less busy with being nervous than being in the music, because usually being nervous takes your attention away from what you're actually doing. So if you can start with focusing exercises, some meditation, maybe some yoga, then you can get this more and more under control. So first of all, there's the philosophy that if you do something wrong on stage, it's okay. And on the other hand, you can prepare better and better as a person, mentally, physically, so you're stronger and you feel stronger when you stand on stage. And I think those things combined can make that we sort of cope in auditions or in concerts. Of course, an audition has always a result. It's different than a concert. It has a result. You might be number 2 and be a very good flute player, but you might not get the job. Does that mean you're bad? No. That means you were very good, but the jury maybe gave 1 point or 1 vote more to the other player. That doesn't mean you're bad. So you have to accept that game also of auditions. You go there and only one can get the job.
Mm-hmm.
That means if number 2 is fabulous, he will go to the next audition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if you start to think a little bit differently about it, there is a possibility to reduce this huge stress, and then it becomes fun again. We should never forget also when we started playing music, we found it fun.
Mm.
Then we become serious young professionals, and we get scared, and that's a pity. We have to try to keep the feeling of what we had when we were children. The love of flute playing, the love of music, and when you were a kid, you didn't even bother about a little mistake or a little note which was too short or too long. Yeah, and then later we become such perfectionists. So think back sometimes also how it was when you were 10 or 11 and you played this instrument and you just had fun with it. That might help us also.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ellie, for that question. We have one from Roz now, and her question is, do you have any advice for young aspiring musicians during these unusual times of COVID-19? How have you used your time during the pandemic, and are there any warm-up exercises you've come back to during this time?
Yes, that's a longer question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, advice to young aspiring musicians: don't lose the faith in music and in art. It is so important for us all. Literature, painting, books, whatever, inspire you to continue. And I'm sure this COVID time will pass, and then life will go on. We have to be optimistic about this. And I'm sure at some point, life will become easy again. What have I done during this whole period? I have practiced a lot, and I decided on day 1 to make very regular practice. Every day, like in the morning and in the afternoon, obligatory, like a sort of mandatory thing. Because we are all humans, and we might sit down with a cup of coffee and forget that it's already midday and we haven't done anything.
Yeah.
So I think routine helps us. So if you can make a kind of routine, doing like warm up, practicing etudes, technique pieces, it helps to get through the day, and it gives you a purpose. You might learn a lot of new pieces. You know, I have a pile here of music which I would love to learn, but I never have time. So I started learning new things. Or I went back to old things, which I did as a student, and I think, hey, how did I play it when I was young? How would I play it now? How would I practice it now? What do I find in it? It's very interesting. So I think we have to keep ourselves busy. There were also some online recordings we made. I think Peter Verhoeven was here recently in your program, and he had a series of live stream every week on Sunday, and I was playing with him also once. So these kind of little projects, which you in the end have to produce yourself, can help you also to keep up the good spirits and to have a target. You can also play through the computer with a colleague or a friend and play duets. Any target is good to keep you going. And what I also tried to do was regular exercise, reading, all the stuff which I sometimes had no time for, I could do now. Cleaning out the house was also a very good one. Or go for bike rides, which I never do because I never have time. So I think we have to find things which keep us going. And for students, I would say use that time to practice. Practice really well. Sometimes when we're students, we have so many subjects to do at school. We have to do harmony and piano second instrument, and you have to write an essay about a composer. And then finally comes COVID, and you can practice. And I think for me, it was an occasion to say, well, you know what? Now I have time. I've been saying for 20 years, I do not have enough time to practice. Well, this is the moment to practice. And that was quite interesting because you go again into a kind of practice which you haven't done for years, which goes much more deeply into things. And you can actually solve also a few little problems. You think, I've always been struggling with my articulation. Well, work on it now because this is the moment. Yeah. So, what was the question furthermore? The warm-up exercises that you haven't done for a while that you have come back to. Yes, I started to play etudes again, studies. Usually I do a warm-up, I do basics every day. I work on my excerpts, I work on my concert program. But there was never time enough to play etudes. Although when I was a student, I would eat them 3, 4 per week, one after the other. One book finished, the next book. And I was actually surprised when I started to do all kinds of different etudes that I got much more fit, even more fit than when I just did a basic program every day. Because it's very different to play through a complete etude of 3 or 4 pages and without stopping, without allowing yourself to stop. So that was a good exercise to do. I also got all of my excerpt books out. And I thought, there's all this stuff you haven't played maybe for years because classical symphony doesn't come up every year. So let's practice it again. Let's see what is in that book which you know and want to practice again, and what is maybe in that book which you've never played. I've got a book now from Henrik Wiese which has opera and symphonic. Now, I've never played opera, or very little. So I also went into opera excerpts because I thought, this beautiful opera from Verdi or from Wagner, I've never actually been able to play, and I have the excerpt. So it's basically keeping yourself busy with interesting things so you don't go into a kind of feeling of being a little depressed. Yeah? So I think it's very important to find ways that you can not get depressed.
Yeah. Which study books are you using at the moment?
Well, I have here, Karek Elert. Do you know them?
Yes.
They're short and tricky and very annoying.
Mm.
Then as a student I played, and I loved them, I played a lot of Jean-Jean. Do you know this book, Paul Jean-Jean? And there's always a more musical etude, and then always a very technical one. And it's a little bit in French style, impressionistic, so I love them very much. And I just started to play through them, like always a technical one and a more musical one. And that keeps you, again, busy for I don't know, 2 hours a day, because you're looking for colors, you're practicing vibrato, you're thinking about the phrasing, and then comes the technical etude, where you probably play things you might not have played for a number of years, because the difficulties in those books are higher than most of the things we play.
Mm.
Yeah. Anderson Opus 15 is also one of my very, very beloved ones. The one with if you practice this one, it's tricky musically, it's tricky for the breathing, it's tricky for your fingers. So when you do that, afterwards you feel a lot stronger. So I think it's a good thing to actually keep doing, playing etudes.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question, Ros. And one from Mike now. Would you say you have a special affinity with any particular repertoire?
Yes. Yes, I think the French repertoire, French impressionistic repertoire, especially for the flute, is very, very special. If you see a piece like Afternoon of a Faun, or Debussy Trio, which is absolutely fabulous, or this little Ravel piece, septet, flute, clarinet, strings, and harp. 9 minutes, but it's so fabulous. It's so well written for each instrument, especially for the flute. But also the whole French repertoire. Another book I took out was this one, with all the French pieces. Of course, we've studied them when we were younger, but you can bring them to a different level now that you have time to actually work maybe on one phrase a day and find a beautiful color. And that's really my preferred repertoire, because I think it suits the flute so well. It's really written for it, and I think that's what I fell in love with was when I was a child. It's this mellowness and colorful and bendable sound of the flute. So that's definitely the repertoire. If you ask me, you can come and do a recital, what you want to play, it will definitely be these pieces.
Brilliant. I think many flute players will agree with you on that one.
Yes.
A question from Amy now. Her question is, you obviously play with the Antwerp Orchestra, but you play in orchestras in other countries occasionally as well. And do you notice a difference in style between these orchestras in different countries? And do you adapt your playing?
Yeah, I think every country has a slightly different sound still, because everybody says, yes, we have internet and recordings, and so everybody plays the same. I don't really think a German orchestra and a British orchestra play the same. In my country, we are very much under the influence of France. We have a lot of French-oriented wind players, so the orchestra sounds certainly different than if you go to Berlin or to the London Symphony. And I think that's also very interesting that we don't all sound the same. So, yes, these differences still exist. Um, of course, through internet, they might have become slightly smaller, the differences, than what they used to be. I think if you listen to American orchestras in the 50s or now, you will probably find that they sound much more European than they used to. If you hear the wind playing, it became much more international than it used to be. And the same goes for every country. Um, so these schools still exist, and I think if you have lessons in Germany, you will most likely go into a German orchestra because sound, articulation, phrasing, use of vibrato is still slightly different than if you go to the Royal Academy in London and get to one of the London orchestras. I think that's also very interesting that when you listen to a concert, it sounds different, although it's the same piece. It sounds different because the orchestra is different. And I think it's still very, very good if we all play with our personality. We don't all have to sound the same. If you listen to a French orchestra, a British orchestra, an American orchestra, it's great that it's different. And you can play music in so many different ways, with so many different phrasings or colors or sounds, that I still find it very, very interesting that these differences exist.
Yeah. It's really interesting hearing from a flute player who actually does play in so many different countries, because I think that's probably quite unusual to play in orchestras from so many different places.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they all have different habits. In the first day, I always try to find out what is the difference in the habits here, and how should I get along with it. I think, for example, in the UK, you work an enormous amount of programs. We have always mostly one program a week. We have 3 days of rehearsal and then 2 or 3 concerts. But other countries function in a completely different way. Some countries have double principals, some do not have double principals, which makes a very, very big difference in the way you can prepare and the speed you have to prepare. I think if you work in a London orchestra, you play probably 3 times or 4 times as much repertoire as in other countries. Yeah? So you have to be a good reader, you have to have a fabulous technique, you don't have time to think, you just go and play. And that's different to other countries where if you have double principals, for example, you can already have more time to practice or do maybe a little more chamber music, a little more teaching. So I still think these differences are quite obvious.
Yeah, brilliant. I have another question now from Mike. His question is, do you have a different mentality or approach for orchestral playing and smaller scale ensemble or solo playing?
Well, I would say orchestral playing is probably the one you have the least influence. Because it's a very big group, there is a conductor who inspires you or tells you what to do, mostly. It's mostly the interpretation of a conductor. When we do Beethoven symphonies with somebody coming from old music interpretation or another conductor, the piece can be very different. Articulation can be different, sound can be different, vibrato use can be different. So there I would say it's merely the conductor who decides which way we all go. and then you follow because you want to make a unity within the orchestra, and you want to bring one interpretation on stage.
Mm.
When you're playing chamber music, you already have much more influence. If you have a wind quintet or you play with harp and viola, for example, you can discuss things, phrasings, dynamics, how should we do this, where should we go with the phrase. So the smaller the group becomes, the more your input is possible. Which is logical also, because if in an orchestra if everybody had his input, we would end up with nothing. Somebody has to make a guideline and say, we are going to make this and this interpretation of this piece.
Yeah.
And then we follow. When you do chamber music, it's already very different because you have much more of a say.
Mm-hmm.
If you play solo, of course, that is probably, if you play solo pieces, that means you by yourself, that means you can go very many different ways. It could even be a little different every day. If you play the same program several times, nobody says you have to play it the same way because you're alone. And you won't also disturb anybody because you've changed your interpretation. That's sometimes very interesting. You do a program with solo pieces, Telemann Fantasy, and Syrinx, and Ibert, this kind of thing. And then you discover that you play it completely differently than yesterday, and it's completely fine because you've disturbed nobody. Yeah. So the smaller the group, the more input is yours. And I think both are very interesting because sometimes you like going with a very good conductor who guides you and even helps you in big solos. I remember doing Brahms Fourth in very different ways depending on the conductor. Mm-hmm. And I always love it when a conductor works with me on this repertoire because I might play it very differently, learn new stuff. Whether I agree or not, that's for later, but you get inspired by different things. And of course, when you play solo or chamber, yes, it's always much more personal.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Mike, for that question. And a question now from Albert. Are you still playing the flute for fun in your leisure time, or is it enough music in your job?
That was a tricky one. Well, my first question back to Albert is, when would I have leisure time? Most of us musicians don't have much leisure time because you're mostly busy with playing, teaching, coaching. Actually, I must say that what I do is my life. So I don't really need leisure time. Mm-hmm. I feel that I'm mostly in leisure time working. Mm-hmm. And that I'm mostly working in leisure time, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So it's a way of living. It's a way of being. And the music and the flute is part of the life, of the daily thing you do. So there is not much of a stop between private and what you do as a flute player, as a musician. Are you still playing the flute for fun? Yes, always. Because I think we are very, very, we can be very, very happy that we do actually our hobby as a job, and that we do something in which we can do something personal also. We're not just going to work, we are saying every night something on a stage with a story. Yeah. And that of course makes it very special. It makes it much closer to you than any regular job, I think. So leisure time and fun combine all the time with work, if you call it work, or duty, or what you have to do in your work, in your teaching. I mean, you have to be serious and work, but it's still always based on something you love.
Yeah.
And that's something very particular we have in our job.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like since the pandemic started, you've had more time to just play for the pure love of it?
Yes. Yes. You can take anything out of the cupboard, open it, play it, put it away, take the next one, or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, of course, very special because it hasn't happened for 25 years that you could just dream away. Mm-hmm. So in one way, I've really hated this pandemic. Mm-hmm. In another way, I have, and I'm not alone with that, a lot of my colleagues and friends say this, there's also a very good side to it. That is that we went back to something very, very normal, being home, practicing, and maybe have time for other things. You go in the forest and walk, and there's no limit of time. You can see some flowers and just follow a path, which in normal life would be not really possible because you have your next rehearsal.
Yeah.
So it of course how difficult it is and how terrible it is for many people who are out of a job, don't have an income, well, every day. It also has a other side which might never come back again in life. I mean, this kind of period of a pandemic, we will probably not see it again, hopefully. And then we will look back in 20 years and say that was a time where we really had, again, a little bit of time for ourselves, maybe also to read a good book,
Yeah.
to just look at the flowers in your garden. So it's very special.
Yeah. And quite a very similar question. Pre-pandemic, how did you find time to practice in your schedule, or did you find time to practice?
Yeah, I tend to always warm up before the orchestra in the morning. Depending on how much time I have, it can be half an hour, it can be 45 minutes. I think you should always find practice time because the danger is that you keep playing, that you never get to the core of your playing again, and that you discover after a few years, ooh, this and this in my playing is not as good as it used to be. So you have to control yourself regularly. Switch on the metronome, switch on the tuner, and maybe discover that you're out of tune now because you've taken bad habits. It's very easy to get bad habits in this profession. Yeah? And another thing is your body. You always have to be aware that you do the right things with your body. So you can, you always have to watch out that you sit properly, you stand properly when you play. So there's always a lot of work which you can and should do regularly, if possible, on a daily basis, so that you're not going the wrong way. Because if you've gone the wrong way, you have to go all the way back, and that takes even more energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, I practice. Yes, I do quite a lot of basics. Even if I have a little time, I do a little bit of everything, a little bit of sound, a little bit of articulation, a little bit of technique, and I try to always keep these basics very important in my daily schedule. Because I think if you overlook them, you might one day end up with a real thing which you have to fix.
Yeah.
And whenever I visit my former professor, Peter Lucas Graaf, he's always practicing. He says, yes, I think I've managed today to play my A3 more softly than yesterday. He's 92 almost. Yeah. So that shows that he, in his age, can still play because his basics are right. And because he trains them. And that's a very important lesson for me, is that this we should not forget. Basics, 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 before you do anything else.
Great. I think this is now our last question for today. It's from Michael, and he says, what do you consider the flute's main strengths or weaknesses?
Main strength is flexibility in colors, possibilities of shaping the sound yourself, much more than other instruments can, because maybe they have a reed or they have a mouthpiece which is very fixed. We are very free playing, so that's probably one of the highest qualities. Yeah, that's mainly that, I would say. And what was your question exactly? Sorry, I forgot.
What do you consider to be the flute's main strengths or weaknesses as an instrument?
Yeah, strength is flexibility, colorful. Weakness is that many of the weaknesses of the flute have gone. We've made instruments now which can play loud, which can articulate well, which are in tune, which wasn't the case 40, 50 years ago. So I think a lot of the downsides have gone. Also because the manufacturing of the instruments is so good nowadays. You can basically not buy a bad flute anymore. 50 years ago, or if you talk to my teachers, you will see that at that time it wasn't the case at all. So I think that became much more easy for the playing. So both are there.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned how flexible the flute is compared possibly to reed instruments. Do you think that other woodwind instruments find it more difficult to blend with a flute because of the difference in how we make the sound?
Yeah, well, I think we are the ones who can change more easily, because we have such a flexible embouchure and we blow half over, half in. You can do a lot of different things with a flute. So I try always, if you play in a wind group or if you play in your orchestra and you play with the winds, to use this flexibility of the flute to make it maybe a little easier for the others who might not have all of that flexibility or being able to go quarter tone higher, quarter tone lower. So I think that flexibility is definitely one of our big qualities. And if we can use that every day, it's a real asset of the flute, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Aldo, for answering all of those questions today. I think
Thank
we've
you
got
for having me and all the people who listened and sent questions. It was very interesting to think about those first before answering.
yes, thank you to everybody who sent in the questions. We've had a really great variety, haven't we, today, which has been really great.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Aldo, and thank you everybody who's watching, and we'll see you all again soon.
Bye bye.